On my second day as a parliamentary intern in the UK House of Commons, I was asked to write a speech on the UK's net zero strategy, or more specifically, on a particular type of renewable energy crucial for achieving the UK's net zero target by 2050. It wasn't solar, wind, or even hydropower as I had expected, but something else, something new to me: trees. Or rather, the burning of woody biomass, which are wood pellets imported from North America for the production of energy. Fair enough, I thought, and eager to please in my new assignment and my new role, I dove into my research. And what I discovered truly shocked me. Because I found out that 12% of the UK's renewable energy is derived directly from woody biomass. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but despite that, this industry has received over £13 billion in subsidies from the UK government. Now, I was curious about what this looked like in other political arenas, so I researched a little bit further, and I found a similar picture. In the EU, over half of their renewable energy can be classified as bioenergy, and about a third of this is derived from woody biomass. Now there, in the European Union, this industry has received over 18 billion euros in subsidies. So what's the problem here? Aren't these just governments subsidizing renewable energy? Isn't that what we want? Well, yes, but through my research, I discovered 3 additional facts. The first is that burning wood for energy production actually emits between 1 and 1.5 times more carbon dioxide than the burning of coal. The second is that this process contributes to rapid deforestation and biodiversity loss. And the third, which was perhaps the most surprising to me personally, was that the process of producing the wood pellets for this energy production actually aggravates climate injustice in North America, because the consequences of it disproportionately affect marginalized communities in those areas. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, that doesn't sound very sustainable. So how can it be a critical part of these countries' sustainability agendas? And you're absolutely right. It's not. And that's the problem. And throughout this whole process, I couldn't help but wonder, why had I never heard of the specifics of biomass energy? Now, keep in mind, I study environmental policy, which is effectively a best practices course for achieving net zero. And I've also worked in 2 European parliaments on issues related to this. So why wasn't biomass more critically and centrally discussed? I thought perhaps it's a problem of how we are defining net zero. Now, most of us have heard the term net zero. In policy circles, when discussing solutions to the climate crisis, this is a phrase which is constantly being recycled. And in 2015, when delegations from around the world met in Paris and agreed under the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, net zero played a critical role. Scientists set 2 benchmarks for achieving this goal. The first was to roughly halve emissions by 2030 in a couple of years. The second was then to achieve a state of net zero by 2050. But what is net zero? Well, according to the United Nations, net zero is the process of reducing carbon emissions to as low a point as possible, and any remaining carbon in the atmosphere will then be reabsorbed by natural processes, such as by forests, oceans, and soil, for instance. And since 2015, this language has become so ingrained in our discussions around the climate crisis. In fact, through global initiatives such as the Race to Zero, over 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered by a net zero target. The UK and the EU are considered particular leaders in this regard and have a quite rare, acceptable level of comprehensiveness in their net zero agendas, according to the Climate Action Tracker. But it's my view, through my research, that in our enthusiasm for committing to net zero and in defining net zero, we've overlooked a critical part of this equation, which is how do we achieve net zero? And if we look into that, as I had to for my research and as I want to present to you today, we find, unfortunately, a much less encouraging picture. But first, I want to back up and talk about the biomass theory. This is how the process of energy production through biomass works. Wood waste products, such as residue and sawdust, and old quality wood, which would not be used for anything else, is sustainably gathered from forests specifically designated for that purpose in North America. Now, this is done by production companies such as Enviva in the United States. This wood, and this old low-quality wood, is processed into wood pellets, which are then transported overseas to production facilities, such as the Drax production station in North Yorkshire, which is the UK's largest biomass production facility. At these facilities, this wood is burned to produce energy, and to conclude the process, trees are planted in the areas where this wood was harvested from. Now, nobody denies that there is a substantial immediate increase in carbon emissions from the transport and the harvesting of these wood pellets. There's actually a term for that, and that's called the carbon debt. But the idea and the theory is that once the trees which are planted in these areas regrow, they will absorb that debt and create a carbon neutral process. Now, the UK government wants to go further with this, and they want to couple this carbon neutral bioenergy production process with carbon capture and storage technology, which is technology that stops the carbon debt from being emitted in the first place by literally capturing and storing the carbon. Now, it's claimed that through this process known as BECCS, we can go beyond carbon neutrality and even reach negative emissions. So all in all, we have this process whereby we can continually produce energy and meet our energy needs at the same rate that we are doing currently, but actually emit less than we are absorbing from the atmosphere. So, sounds simple to me, right? We're saved. This is the perfect, simple solution to the climate crisis. Now, unfortunately, that would be a pretty short talk. And if I have learned one thing in my courses and work, it's not about the specifics of biomass, but it is that there are no perfect, simple solutions to the climate crisis. And this approach, relying on biomass, unfortunately, is misleading and misguiding and doesn't work. And here's why. The first reason are the emissions. In 2019, emissions from US sourced pellets in the UK's biomass production process contributed between 13 and 16 million tons of carbon dioxide. Now, this figure takes into account both the carbon directly emitted into the atmosphere, that is the carbon debt, but also foregone sequestration, which are the emissions which had already been absorbed by this wood or could have been absorbed by this wood had it not been processed for this purpose. Now, critically, none of these emissions were counted in the UK or the EU's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, meaning that any acceptable ranking they might have when it comes to emissions reductions is based, at least in part, on incomplete data because it excludes these emissions. Now, the theory does get one thing right, and that is that this process is carbon neutral. The trees which are planted will eventually reabsorb the debt created by this process. The problem is that takes decades or even centuries. In fact, recent studies have shown it could take anywhere from between 44 to 340 years for this carbon debt today to be reabsorbed. The second issue is that this process contributes to rapid deforestation and biodiversity loss. Now, the companies will claim that this isn't the case because they source from particularly designated areas of the forest and only particular types of wood. But this isn't true. A recent study by the EU's Joint Research Centre has found that at least 37% of the wood harvested for the EU's biomass production process from 2009 to 2015 is classified as primary woody biomass, which includes main parts of the stem. So it's not just waste products. Another investigation done by the BBC found that only 11% of the wood used in the Drax, North Yorkshire biomass production facility was classified as the lowest quality wood. So it's clear that other wood resources are being used, and this fundamentally threatens biodiversity. Now, why is biodiversity so critical to maintain? Well, because the greater variety of species an ecosystem has, the better able it is to respond to threats, and the healthier it remains. And a healthier ecosystem is then better able to provide fundamental services to support human existence, such as purifying air and water, recycling nutrients in our soil, and mitigating climate risk. So the fact that this process threatens our existence on this planet. And finally, we need to consider who and which communities this process affects the most. According to the Cut Carbon Not Forest initiative, the areas in which this wood is harvested from are more than 50% more likely to be located in economically depressed areas of color rather than richer, more affluent neighborhoods in the United States. So not only does this process rob these communities of their natural resources by literally taking their trees from them, but the emissions that come from the production of these wood pellets will disproportionately affect the communities living in these areas. In fact, in the United States, over half of the production facilities built with the sole purpose of feeding foreign demand for woody biomass pellets have failed to install the legally required pollution controls, which places communities living in these areas at a much greater risk for developing very severe health consequences. So I think it's clear that this process is really not sustainable or equitable or even carbon neutral in the time frame that we need it to be. And this is why numerous groups of scientists and activists have petitioned governments to cease subsidizing this industry, and some progress has been made. In September 2022, the European Parliament voted on a revision of its Renewable Energy Directive. According to this revision, certain types of primary woody biomass would no longer be classified as renewable and therefore not be eligible for subsidies. But they did not go so far as to declassify this entire system as renewable. So the broader problem remains, and that is across the board, the burning of wood for energy production remains seen as a fundamentally carbon neutral, sustainable, and a critical part of the net zero agenda. Now, this brings me back to my original question. Why had I never heard of this before in my work and my studies? Well, I think this is a powerful demonstration of governmental greenwashing. Now, what is greenwashing? Greenwashing is the act of making a product, policy, or process appear less environmentally destructive or more environmentally friendly than it in reality is. And we often associate this term with the private sector, with a specific company or product, for instance. But I think this example provides a very powerful demonstration of how greenwashing can manifest in the public space. And it's not that we're unaware. It's also not that politicians are unaware of the dangers of this process. In fact, the UN Secretary General himself has said that the commitment to net zero cannot be a mere public relations exercise on the part of governments and companies. And we can all agree with this statement, but I want to challenge us to dig deeper. I want to challenge us to consider that perhaps it's not the commitment to net zero which is causing this gap in the rhetoric and the reality of the net zero agenda, but rather how we are going to get there. And also, critically, how we, as civil society, are holding our governments to account. Because we often criticize our governments for being too nearsighted, and we point out how short-term economic gain and electoral success is prioritized over long-term environmental benefits. And we rightly point this out. This is important. But at the same time, we need to focus on how we hold our governments to account. We need to demand outcomes, not outputs. Because in this process, we have the opposite phenomenon happening, where governments are looking too far into the future and neglecting these very real short-term consequences of their actions. And as civil society, we have a responsibility to point that out. Now, why am I sharing this with you today? Well, on one hand, I wanted to share this with you today because the fact that the substance of net zero is not a more critical part of this discussion greatly concerns me, both in academia as well as in policy work. But more importantly, I want to share this with you today because I believe that there is a light at the end of the tunnel and that there is hope. Because I believe in the power of information and of collective action. And I believe in the responsibility that we have as young scholars, activists, policymakers, and researchers to use the information that we have to inform and to inspire. We need to demand outcomes from our politicians, not just outputs and rhetorical promises. Now, as for me, the speech I wrote, or being generous with myself there, a heavily edited version of the speech I wrote was delivered in a Westminster Hall debate on biomass subsidies within the UK. I don't know what the specifics outcomes of that debate will be, but I do know that personally I feel more prepared to critically engage in discussions surrounding net zero in my work and in my studies. Now, some of you have more information than I am. Some of you have larger networks, more influence, different passions. I urge you all to leverage the information that you are privy to inform and to inspire, to encourage a broader engagement of and more critical understanding of policy initiatives. Because by doing that, together, we can work to hold our governments to account in whatever policy arena it is that you are passionate about, and work to achieve a truly sustainable, truly equitable, and perhaps, against all odds, a net zero future. Thank you.